Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest is Bobbie Big. Bobbie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Vic.
Hey Bobbie, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Bobbie, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, my name is Bobbie. I was born in the mid-50s in the Kootenays of British Columbia, in a small town in the Rockies, with a population of about 3,500 people at the time. It was nestled in the Rocky Mountain Trench between the Rockies and the Purcell Mountain Ranges. This area was and is home to the Ktunaxa Native people, and their Indian reservation is nearby. As a youngster, I had typical interests: motorbikes, cars, exploring, and mountains and guns, and we lived close to the edge of town, so it was always easy for me to meander deep into the bush back then. I would go out with a friend of mine every chance we got after school, especially on weekends, and shoot up the bush, so to speak, as we called it. We started out with BB guns and graduated to very powerful pellet guns before moving on to powder-actuated guns, then hunting big game throughout the years. I never liked tree stand hunting, as I equated that to fishing. We covered ground, and lots of it, as there was unlimited mountains and bush to cover, so we walked or pedaled our bikes, or later on even motorcycles, and explored it all the often, and sometimes even overnight. Our favorite game was to see how quiet we could be and sneak up on an animal before it would hear us or see us or smell us. The hardest was wolves and coyotes. If we found a coyote den and they had pups, they would get aggressive or try to lead us away from the den. My biggest influence as a youngster was my father, as most boys. He was an old-timer. He was born in 1903. He knew that valley like the back of his hand. He was a farmer, woodsman, logger, prospector, owned a trucking company, hauling railway ties for the Canadian Pacific Railway. My father was not big on hunting, but he was very good at it, and told me one time he was in a logging camp and he had no meat for the men. So he borrowed a 30-30 Winchester, went about a mile from camp. In a half hour, he shot 2 mule deer, had them gutted, skinned, butchered, cooked, and on the dinner table that night. I had an interest in cryptids from a very young age. The Sasquatch hunter was coming to town at the local stage and cinema in 1968, where I met Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. Unfortunately, later in life, I found out Bob Gimlin was actually Al Diatley, as those in attendance were led to believe. Al Diatley was Roger's brother-in-law, and they had cut Bob out of the loop. Roger gave the narrative about the encounter, and they both took questions after. At that showing, I saw the original celluloid film of Patty taken at Bluff Creek, and her famous right shoulder turn for the first time. The biggest problem I had with Patty at the time was her face. You have to remember, this was 1968. There was no pictures of Bigfoot or slow motion or zooming on film back in the day. Nowadays, that film has been analyzed every which way to Sunday. My father was not a big storyteller, so it was hard to get information from him. You had to really pry incidents out of him. When I asked my father about Sasquatch, he told me of occurrences at certain times of year outside logging and prospecting camps, about strange shrieks and howls at night that were not wolves, bears, or mountain lions. He also stated that the elders from the local tribe said they still existed along with other entities, and some were spiritual, but they still had flesh and blood. But they were very reluctant to talk to white people about them because of the ridicule that they received about their existence. There were many local stories and legends about Sasquatch in the Kootenays, British Columbia. By the late 70s, I moved from the western slopes of the Rockies to the eastern slopes on the other side of the Continental Divide. The eastern side of the Rockies gets less precipitation in the west, both rain and snow, and it is more arid climate. A lot of the flora and fauna are similar, but there are regional differences. I continued to hike, camp, mountain climb, and hunt regularly. I never trophy hunted as I did not believe in it. I only harvested what I could eat or give to other people to eat. It was never about putting a stuffed bus on a wall, per se. I do not always carry a gun with me when I go out into the mountains, as in some areas they are strictly prohibited to carry, and if you do, and the Fish and Game Warden catch you, you're only going to lose your firearm, but you're going to be heavily fined, and repeat offenders go to jail. So you're limited in some of the areas I go to because of their designation to carrying bear spray or bangers or horns or bells, or do what I do when I'm in grizzly and cougar country. I actually lash a 12-inch bayonet and a dagger blade with a razor-sharp tip on it to a 6-foot walking staff that I use. I do carry bear spray with me, and believe me, I've used both of them. Now, getting to my Dogman encounter, I didn't know exactly what they were. I thought they possibly could exist in North America. I did not know. I thought it was possible because of history through the ages of accounts of werewolves and upright walking dogs, and I believed they could exist, but I didn't believe they existed out west in Canada or northwestern United States, more of an eastern and southern, maybe Midwest phenomenon. And my incident was more of a sighting than an encounter. It wasn't a woo-woo moment of a large black creature stretching at my screen or something in the middle of the night. My encounter happened in October. I believe it was the 23rd of October of 2015 in a remote area called Ghost River Valley of Alberta. I'm quite familiar with that area as I go out there often. It does have the highest designation of government protection of public lands in Canada. It's even above Banff National Park, which it borders. This area is over 40,000 acres of spruce, fir, lodgepole, pine, sedges, grasses, wildflowers. It's home to bighorn sheep, deer, elk, moose, cougars, black bear, and of course grizzlies. The usual suspects are rodents, I'm sure. They're always, the squirrels, Rocky Mountain pack rats, rabbits, and the like. And there's also more sheer vertical rock than you could climb in a lifetime. And that's, I guess, why they call it the Rocky Mountain. There is no hunting, no fishing, no four-wheeling, no horses, no quadding, or motorbikes. So if any creatures want to avoid man, this would be the place to be for sure. And there's no private land ownership or development of services of any kind in this area. It has been designated to stay wild, as the term wilderness implies. It is kind of buffered by a DG Wildlands Provincial Park. That is a less restrictive designation on the way into the area. It is a very rugged and imposing area of country. There's lots of vertical peaks. The river valley of the Ghost River is like a large floodplain that ranges from about 1/8 of a mile to about a mile wide and is completely boxed in by mountains to the north and south. They range from 6,000 to 11,000 foot peaks. This encounter that I had happened in broad daylight. It was in the afternoon between 3 and 3:30. I had been hiking by myself all day, and I was on my mountain bike with a backpack on and had to ford the river several times that day. Being late fall, the river runs more like a large creek at that time of year. My plan that day was to stay low in the riverbed on my mountain bike, as I was by myself and not venture into the high mountain areas where the game trails and the passes were. The channel of the river in the riverbed kind of meanders back and forth from side to side of the mountainside, and you have no choice but to cross the river unless you go vertical. There was a massive flood event in this area which exceeded the kind of the last previous 100 years. And we never had it for a very long period of time. That occurred in 2013. and it made it much harder to navigate than my previous trips into the valley. After crossing the river 3 times and only getting my feet wet, the 4th time I completely fell into the river, and I knew I had to get my clothes off. I was in the shadows of the valley from the mountains, as the sun was already lower in the south and obscured by the mountains and the fall sky. The temperature was cooling down, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The water was cold. It was only a few miles upstream. It's formerly ice and snow from the high mountain peaks. I gathered myself and my gear, and I headed to the north side of the riverbed, where the sun was shining on a gravel bar, where I could take my clothes off and warm up a bit. I took off my clothes and wrung them out and hung them on a large fallen tree snag that was lying on the gravel bar. There was a slight breeze blowing, and that was kind of helping my clothes dry. At this point, I decided to go no further, and I knew I had to cross the river 4 times more to get back to my camp. I found a dry sweater in my backpack and a dry pair of shorts. I would keep my water moccasins on for my return river crossings, as I put my hiking boots tied up to the top of my backpack and a dry pair of socks in the bottom of my pack for later after the river crossing. As I was getting dressed, I noticed a large track line of a single wolf track in the sand, walking west to east, kind of fading slightly to the north towards the tree line on the north side of the river. This is not unusual in this area. There's a pack of wolves they call the Wilmore Pack, and they do frequent the Ghost River as part of their range. This track was fairly fresh for sure, and it was a large, very large track. It indicated to me it was a mature male or a very large female. Wolves don't frighten me really. I do respect them, and I have encountered them and their cousins, the coyotes, many times. They are masters of watching from the shadows, and I had this feeling all day that I was being watched, but not stalked or followed per se, as my field of vision was very good in the broad, wide riverbed. However, I could also easily be seen in the open riverbed from the high ground of the mountain, either from the south or the north of me. So I continued on. I made my way back across the river 4 more times without falling in, and I had a fairly easy 2-mile pedal after that back to my camp. To the south of me is a ridgeline called Phantom Crag, or Devil's Fang, and there is a cave just above a scree line below the head wall, far below the peak of the Fang. And I was looking up in this area, and I'm always looking at my horizon and turning around and, doing 360s, especially when I'm by myself in the wilderness. I never listen to earbuds or anything like that, or cover my ears, or wear a toque or a cap if I can help it, because I always want to be aware of my surroundings. I want to see, I want to hear, and I'm always as quiet as I can be. As I was looking at the scree line, I saw a black upright figure traversing the scree line from the west to the east that was walking towards a cave opening that was in front of the head wall, and it became obscured for a moment by trees lower in the tree line that were in the foreground and lower. So I lost view of it for a minute, and I did not have my binoculars with me because they were back in my camp. So I fumbled and got my pack off, and I dug out my little camera that I had with me. I was direct line of sight. I would say I was just over a mile from this figure. So I dug out my camera and I focused just in at full field of view and snapped a shot. And then it's got a little zoom on it. I think it's about a 12 times zoom optical. So I zoomed in on it, and I couldn't see it. So I didn't know if it had dropped down or ran up into the cave. By this time, I could no longer see it with my naked eye. So I knew it must have gone into the cave or dropped out of my field of view into the trees that were in the foreground. Below the tree line, it was not out of the question to see mountain climbers in the area. But this didn't look like a mountain climber because it was totally black and the scale of it was too tall. And, usually that late in the day, you don't see somebody that high up by themselves, all dressed in black. And like I say, the scale seems wrong. By the time I got my camera to my pack and got back focused on the rock face, it was out of sight. And so that thing, I know that cave. I'm familiar with it. I know the distance up there. It had to have moved across that tree line awfully fast, faster than like I could when I was 20. And that's a very steep slope, about a 25-degree slope. On my best day, I don't think I could have pulled that distance off and gotten into that cave. So then I couldn't really make out on my screen, because it's a small camera, what was inside the mouth of the cave. So I thought, well, it went in, it'll come out, because I know that cave well. And, it only goes back about 20 or 25 feet straight back, and then it dead ends. So I waited for about 15 minutes, stationary in the spot in the riverbed, and nothing moved. So I thought that if I could see it, it could see me. So I decided to go north, across the riverbed, away from it, into the tree line, on the other side of the river, so it could not see me, because I felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the move. I waited for another half hour in the tree line on the other side of the river, peeking with the zoom on my camera to see if I could see if anything moved out of the mouth of that cave. And it did not. So I gave up. I was cold, tired, and hungry. And when I returned home the next morning, I downloaded the pictures that I'd taken from the sighting, and I could see more clearly that I was looking at something that appeared to me that was large and black and kind of sitting in a sitting position in the side of the cave. Not only did it seem to be huge compared to a human, but it appeared to me like it had a wolf's head. But even more bizarre, this is where the story really gets strange, because this thing that was beside it appeared to me to be a giant brownish red cow thing with huge eyes bulging out of its head. It is hard to get a great deal of detail out of my camera shots, because the camera only has I think 16 megapixels. Now, I do not think this is a case of pareidolia on my part. For your listeners, this is a phenomenon that is recognizing patterns or shapes and familiar objects in a vague and sometimes random stimulus, and the result of your brain trying to kind of make sense of input that really has no sense to find in it. And that, I guess, pretty much sums up my sighting. I've never seen an animal for that long or at that distance that I could not identify before. So it kind of totally blew my mind when I got home and zoomed in on that picture on my computer and saw it sitting there watching me. But that figure to the right of it just kind of doesn't make any sense to me at all. And that kind of sums up my encounter, or more of a sighting, I think, than an encounter, due to the distance I was away from it.
For any of you out there who are listening to the playback of this on YouTube and not watching the screen, you might want to work your way over to the screen, because I've got this picture that Bobbie's been talking about posted right now, and it's zoomed in, so you can take a look and see what you think of it. Bobbie, I'm sitting here looking at a zoomed in version of this picture you sent me. On the left-hand side of the cave, I see what looks to be a dogmanish type figure. The picture is granulated to the point where I can't tell for sure that that's what I'm looking at, but it sure does fit the bill, and it could very easily be a dogman that's standing there. If it is a dogman, it looks to me like I see its right eye. It looks like it's facing to the right towards that black subject that's on the right side of the cave. As far as that black subject on the right side of the cave would go, I'm not really sure what to make of that. The more I look at it, it looks like it might be some kind of a Sasquatch with its back to the camera, but I still can't see enough detail to come to any firm conclusions on that. Is there anything about this picture, now that it's up on all of our screens, that you could tell us about that you haven't already gone over?
Well, like I say, I know that cave. I've been up to it physically, not recently. I believe the last time I was up into that cave was in the 90s. And like I say, it doesn't go back very far. It dead ends. And to get up to that cave, you've got to do a fair hike. Like, it'll take you from the river bottom where I was viewing it. For me to do it would have taken me a better part of 2.5 hours to get to that entrance of that cave by foot. So there's some pretty good hiking to get up into that area. I don't know, Vic, if that cave was a natural formation after the glaciers retreated and it was water carved, or if it was an anomaly of the stratification breaking free in the mountain. But it is a fairly big impression into the side of that head wall.
Until just now, I didn't realize that you had been up in that cave before. I thought you'd only looked at it as you were going down that riverbed.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, and I always look up into that mountain, which is part of Mount Costigan, where Devil's Fang is. Some climbers call it Phantom's Crag, and some climbers call it the Devil's Fang. It's the same thing. Of course, this cave is much lower than the peak of the Fang itself, because it's just at the base of the head wall before the rock face goes basically vertical. And that's not the route that climbers use to climb that mountain. They go around the other way from the southeast side, and I was looking at the north side of the mountain.
Oh, I see. Being as familiar as you are with that cave, looking at that subject on the left-hand side of the opening, from having been up in that cave, how big would you say that subject would be on the left?
I'd say that subject would have to be pretty close to 7 foot or better. I say for sure he's bigger than a 6-foot man, because I can remember being in that cave where it appears to me it's almost in a sitting position. And if I was standing where it appears to be sitting, its head is still taller than I am, and I'm 6'2", and I'm 235 pounds. And I'd say that thing outweighs me by an easy 150 pounds and a good foot taller.
Yeah, it does look like it's got quite a bit of mass to it. Its head looks pretty big too. Bobbie, you live in a beautiful part of Alberta with a lot of mysterious and scary places around it. Does that add to the allure of living there for you or detract from it?
Well, I think it's definitely an allure. I've always been attracted to the mountains, growing up on the other side of the Rockies, on the western slopes and the Kootenays, and always going into the woods and the bush and hunting and camping and exploring, and then coming into the Alberta side. It always interested me to continue going into the mountains, and the Ghost was a very special place to me as soon as the first time I went there, because it just has a whole different feeling. It has a whole different edge to it. It's known by the natives as being a pretty spooky place, and a lot of the names that the natives gave the area kind of portray that as well. They had a lot of legends and a lot of fears about that area, because they used to skirt that area and go just to the west of it, because the Ghost River has 2 channels. It's got a northern fork and a southern fork. And the natives used to go through a place called Devil's Gap, which is between the 2 forks of the river. I typically go into the north fork where this cave is. And the Indians would kind of split it, and they would go into an area called Devil's Gap. And then, you wonder why they have all these names like Devil's Gap and Ghost River and Phantom Crag and Devil's Head and all these things. And it's because these names were given to the area by the Stoney Nakoda people that live in this area. And they showed the first white men the path to get through, to go across the Continental Divide over the top of the Rockies onto the western slopes, which lead now into British Columbia. company ever in the world, which was in Canada. And they bought all of the hides and pelts from the early trappers. And they always used native guides to show them how to get through the mountains. And this is where they took them, was they took them through the Lake Minnewanka Pass, which was known as Devil's Gap. And then they diverted the Ghost and flooded Lake Minnewanka into a much larger lake than it naturally was, because they built a hydro dam at the west end of it. So they no longer could use that as the pass. So then when the Canadian Pacific Railway came through, they went and followed what we call the Bow River Valley, which is to the west of it. And then, of course, the Trans-Canada Highway followed that, and that now is what we use to go into British Columbia. So the Ghost area kind of got abandoned, and the natives, for the most part, they didn't like going deep into the Ghost, into the North Fork where I go. They more or less avoided it.
When you go into the Ghost, how does it feel for you compared to the other places you go?
The Ghost is a strange place. It's the kind of place I'm always looking over my shoulder. I've spent lots of nights in the bush. I've spent lots of nights in the wilderness on both sides of the Rockies. And the Ghost always has this kind of eerie feeling about it. I don't really know how to explain it. There's always kind of an uneasiness. You know, you're always checking your six, checking your back. Not a lot of people go in there. It's pretty rugged country and it's very remote. And the only way you can get into that area is on foot, really. I was on my bike that day, but if I would have kept going a little bit further, even being on my bike would have been illegal, because you can't take any motorized vehicles or even horses into that area. You've got to hoof it. And it's quite remote.
It sure sounds like it. When you came across those prints that day, did you ever measure them?
No, I didn't. I didn't have a tape with me. And I was a little bit perplexed by those prints, because that night, the night of the 23rd, when I was out there, the next day, it had frozen that night. There was a frost. And there wasn't a lot of standing water anywhere, but there was a couple of puddles on the roadway. And I noticed in the morning when I got up, I went for a little walk from my camp, and I saw that the ice on the top of this puddle, which was a thin layer of ice that was only about a quarter of an inch thick, because it wasn't a heavy frost overnight, but it was enough to skin the top of the puddle, that it had been broken, that something had stepped in it. And I thought, well, coyote, wolf, maybe a bear. And I looked and kind of flipped the pieces of ice up, because underneath there was standing water and it was still muddy underneath. And I was trying to discern what type of print it was. And at first I thought, oh, it was a bear. It was quite wide and wider than a wolf, and obviously a lot wider than a coyote, and it definitely wasn't a hoofed animal. And then I kind of looked at it really close, and it was longer than a black bear print. And then I tried to discern where it made its next step, like which direction was it going to come across the road or cross it diagonally. And I couldn't find another print until I looked right to the far side of the road, and then I could see where that foot was wet from breaking into the puddle, and it made an outline. And the outline was narrower than a bear print for sure, but it was also a lot longer. So I couldn't tell what it was. I couldn't tell whether it was a bear, a wolf, or a coyote print. I couldn't discern what it was.
If you had to guess on the size of those prints, how big do you think they were?
I would say that they were a good 10 10 inches long total from what I could see, because there was no soft earth, there was no mud or sand that made a deep impression. It was just from where it stepped in the puddle and then continued across the road, and its foot was still wet. So I didn't get a really good impression of it.
Yeah, if it was that big, it definitely wasn't a wolf.
No, I don't think it was a wolf for sure. Sometimes when bears walk, especially black bears, their back legs will step into their front footprints. And I've seen that many times in gravel beds and sandbars and mud, and a lot of people mistake those for, Bigfoot or Sasquatch prints, but they're just really bear prints. I'm familiar with that when you get a really good impression of what it is. This, whatever it was either running or jumping, because the distance was too far apart. It didn't appear to me to be a quadruped. I would say it would have been something more upright, because a quadruped, they have to leave obviously 4 tracks, whereas something that's bipedal, you leave less numbers of tracks and can cover the same area, especially if you have long legs. So I didn't see a quadruped. I believe I saw a bipedal animal.
Oh, I'd say you did too. How much distance would you guess is between those prints I have up on the screen right now?
I would say it was a good, almost like 7 feet. Like, it was a long distance. So I think that the dry foot landed and I couldn't see it. And then I think the wet foot landed again. So I would say the stride was about 4 feet apart, 3.5 to 4 feet apart. And then the wet foot landed down again. And then I couldn't discern any more prints than that, because then it went into kind of a grassy, sedge grass kind of area where there was no way you could discern any prints. So the distance between the break in the puddle and the distance of the next wet mark, I would say was 7.5 feet. So if the other foot that was dry landed and I couldn't tell where that was, I would divide that by 2. So I'd say the stride was 3.5, 4 feet at the most each.
Yeah, that's what you would expect from a creature that's about 7 or 8 feet tall. Something I want to mention, Bobbie, is the fact that from time to time someone will reach out to me and say that these people are seeing forepaw prints from grizzly bears and mistaking them for dogman paw prints. Being an outdoorsman like you are, I'm sure you realize that forepaw prints from a grizzly have 5 toe prints in them instead of 4 like a dogman track would have. If you know what to look for, as I'm sure you do, there's no mistaking the two.
Exactly, and this print was not as wide as even a mature male black bear, let alone a grizzly bear. It was longer and narrower, so that's why I discount it being a bear.
As the listeners have a chance to look at this pic I have up on the screen right now, they'll understand instantly why we're saying it was not a grizzly bear that left those prints. Last October, Bobbie, you went into the Ghost River area without your usual travel companion. Please tell us about that trip.
Well, that trip was kind of in memory of my dog that I had. I had a Doberman Pinscher for 12 years that went with me every day, everywhere I went. And him and I, we did thousands of feet of vertical together. That old boy, he hung in there to the end, and we used to go into the Ghost together quite frequently and camp out and hike around. And that trip was kind of thinking about him and the times we used to go into the bush out there. I decided to go it alone that trip and spend 2 nights out there and just kind of have some solitude with myself and my thoughts. And I had this crazy sighting.
After you had that sighting, did it change the wilderness for you, or is everything pretty much business as usual for you when you go out into it?
For me, Vic, it's more business as usual. Whatever I saw, whatever it was, I know I've never seen that before. Now, being that I'm so well versed in all the animals that are in this area, I've seen wolverine, I've seen lots of grizzlies, I've seen black bear, and I never hunted bear. My prime suspects were always deer and elk, sometimes moose, because deer and elk are my favorite meat. Like I stated, I don't believe in trophy hunting animals, and at my age, that's not what it's about anymore. It's about getting out there and seeing them. The animals are all beautiful until you kill them. Once you kill them, they're a dead animal. There's a difference. And I believe that the majestic, mature animals of all type should be allowed to procreate and let their genetics reign true, because that's why they are the older alpha, is because their genetics saw them through to that, and they should be allowed to propagate onward. And being that my sighting was more of a sighting and not an encounter because of the distance, if that creature, whatever it was, would have come into my camp, it might have been a different story. But being that the distance was so far, it didn't really shake me to my core, where I feel that I'm scared of the wilderness, or I'm more wary to go out there. I think I'm fine with that. But now I know that there are obviously things out there that I didn't know existed.
Things that go bump in the night.
That's for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately. You sent me several pictures showing areas that you've gone into on your camping excursions. I'm going to post those now so that the listeners can follow along as you tell us about them. Please tell us about this first picture I've got up. What does it show?
Well, most of these pictures that I sent you, Vic, are the pictures close to the cave where I had my sighting. And this is the entrance into the Ghost River Wilderness area, which is really what they call the GG Wildlands Parks, which buffer the Ghost River Wilderness. It's almost right on the edge of the entrance to the Ghost River Wilderness proper. It's all in the Ghost River area, but the government gives it two different disembarkation points. Very close to this sighting, the pictures I showed you, there's a picture of, I believe I sent you, Devil's Head. And Devil's Head is a mountain that's across from my sighting, further to the west, because directly across from my sighting is another mountain called Black Rock Mountain. And the reason it's called Black Rock is because it's limestone, and it takes on a very black hue, especially when the rock gets wet. And to the west of Black Rock lies Devil's Head, which was named by the Indians because it resembled a face or a head, a spirit, which they portrayed as being, I guess you could say, demonic, being devil. And they wouldn't climb that mountain, but they would put offerings on the lower ledges of it, like such grasses and wrappings of different things that they would give to their spirits to keep them up there, up in Devil's Head, and not come down into the valley. And that's what the Stoney Nakoda native peoples believed about that mountain.
This next picture I've got up, it looks like I'm looking down a dry riverbed. What can you tell us about this picture?
This picture is of me and the ghost on the 23rd of October. And this is about 2 miles further west up the riverbed from my sighting. And I'm looking almost due east in this shot. And I'm standing in the riverbed, which is actually the Ghost River. Now that picture does not portray how mighty the Ghost River can be. As you can see, it's a very wide riverbed. And this river, when it's rocking in the spring runoff, when we get our heavy rains and we've got a big snowpack, this whole area from the left of the screen where you see the tree line all the way over to the far right in the dark shadows is solid water. And it would be anywhere from 5 to 12 feet deep. And it's moving. And as you can see in this picture, there's lots of tree snags from old falls that have eroded off of the banks into the riverbed. And all as you see in the picture is a little trickle of a stream down the center. The main channel of the ghost, we can't see it. It's way over to the left of the screen towards the tree line, and it's out of sight. And the river is still flowing, but it's more like a creek at this time of year because it's in late October. And most of the runoff from the ghost comes in the spring from melting snow and spring rains.
I see. This next picture that I've got up now, it looks like it's showing some kind of a stick structure. What can you tell us about that structure?
Well, this picture, when I came across this, I kind of shook my head. This was not far off of the riverbed. It's still kind of on a gravel bar. And then you can see on the far side of the structure, you can see it goes into the tree line. But it was built almost like on an old gravel bed. And when I first saw it, I was about a half a mile, maybe 3/4 of a mile from it. And I could discern that there was something there that I knew was not there in the previous years I had been in this area. So I walked towards it and came upon it. And as I came upon it, I was like, okay, what the heck is this? And what built it? Now, my first impression was it was built by a man. And then I looked at it really close, and all of the sticks were either snapped, broken, or old waterlogged debris from the river from the floods. They weren't cut with a saw or an axe. And then the branches that made up the walls were placed upside down. And then the moss and the lichens that they pulled from the tree line were placed on top of the branches and the twigs. And then they also stacked rocks along the border around the perimeter, the outside of it. And the basis of the structure was, as you can see at the top of the picture, a tree fall coming down from the tree line onto the gravel bar. And then there's actually another one that's really hard to see, and that was the basis of the beginning of the structure. And it was quite shallow. It wasn't deep. Like, for me to get in there, I'd have to get down on my hands and knees where the big rocks are to the left of the picture, and I would have to crawl in. So it was about, I'd say at the opening, it was about 4 or 5 feet wide and about 2.5 to 3 feet tall at its tallest point. And it went back about 8 feet, 9 feet at the deepest corner.
Standing that close to that structure, did you notice anything outside of what you could see? Did you detect anything with any of your other senses?
When I approach the structure, I'm very quiet when I walk. I don't kick stones. I don't scuff my feet. I'm a very stealthy person in the wilderness. That's the way I've always operated. And if anybody knows, it's pretty hard to walk on loose gravel quietly because there's going to be rock movement, and rock clacking travels. That sound moves. I walked up to it as quiet as I could because I did not know what I was approaching, and I did not know what was in it because my approach angle was not from the entrance. Therefore, I approached it with caution, and I actually picked up a river stone and threw it onto the top of the structure to see if anything would flush out of it or move, because I was approaching it from the closed end and I could not see the opening on the east side because I had approached it from the west side. And once I got up to it, I heard a noise about 1 or 2 minutes after I arrived, deep back into the tree line, up high. Now, I don't believe I have a picture of what lies deep past that tree line. That tree line goes back about a half a mile. and then it hits another straight vertical head wall of rock that goes straight up. And the only way you can climb that is if you're Spider-Man. And it would be pretty hard to go past that area into the rock face. Now, the noise, I couldn't tell if it was up high in the rock face or if it was in the tree line. I couldn't even discern what the noise was. It was not really a call. It was more of a tree stamp. And I stopped and listened and waited, and I heard no more noise, no movement, no call, nothing.
When you were standing that close to that structure, did you smell anything?
No, and I looked for scat. I looked for some bushmen come out here and try to build a primitive structure to prove that this is how they would live. And if they did, where's the fire ring? Where's the fire? There was no charcoal. There was no fire ring. There was no wrappers from man. There was nothing to indicate to me that there had been a fire in that structure. And I had no smell. And I saw no scat.
Well, it sure does make you wonder. All right, Bobbie, I've got another picture up showing what I think is a different angle of that same stick structure. What can you tell us about what we're looking at here?
Yeah, this picture is the picture of the entrance to it. From the previous picture, this entrance would have been on the left-hand side of the previous picture. And so the entrance faced east, and I was looking into it, looking west. And you can see how kind of rudimentary it is. And you can see the moss and lichens that are inside of it, like as in bedding. And you can see that some of those twigs and sticks, they're evergreen trees. And they still are green, and some of them are brown and dead. Like I say, I saw no saw marks, cut marks to indicate that these pieces of the structure were built by a man.
You know, Bobbie, the fact that you noticed that there were no cut marks on those sticks, the sticks apparently had been snapped instead, that's just another testament to how experienced you are out there in the woods. You definitely know what you're doing out there, and I'm impressed. All right, Bobbie, I've got a picture of the prints in the dirt up on the screen right now. What else can you tell us about these tracks or anything else in this pic?
This picture is a picture of what I believe was a wolf track line in the sandbar, which is mixed in with the gravel in the riverbed on the far north side of the riverbed. And this was about, I would say this was about 2.5 miles from my sighting in the cave. And at first, when I saw it, I thought, wow, those are big wolf prints. That's a big boy. And then as I looked at them closer, I thought, these are like huge, like way bigger than the average timber wolf in the Ghost area. I would say those were probably the biggest wolf prints I've ever seen.
Yeah, I could understand why you would think that. Another thing I noticed about this picture is they have a left-right-left pattern instead of a left-left, right-right pattern you'd see from a quadruped. With that in mind, it still wouldn't fit for being a wolf, even if those prints were smaller.
Right. Now, one thing about wolves, they're built a little bit different than even, let's say, like a German Shepherd or a canine. They're narrower in the chest once they go down towards their legs. And wolves are known, they walk more in a straight line than dogs do, than domesticated dogs. However, they usually do not walk in that straight of a line. And so that got my attention as well. Wolves are very efficient walkers. They'll travel anywhere from 20 to 30 miles in a day if they want to, if they're so inclined. And this wolf pack that is in this valley, they actually have 2 members radio collared. I know some of the Fish and Game boys, and they monitor where they go and what they do, the members of the pack that are collared.
Speaking of the Fish and Game guys you just mentioned, Have they ever shared any stories about possible Dogman sightings in that area with you?
Well, most of the old timers that I knew, I called them, they're retired now. And I had a pretty good rapport with those fellas because I had seen them for years in the areas that I go into and converse with them. Now we've kind of got new blood in there and a new batch of younger guys. I don't have the rapport with them I had with the older fellas, but we used to share things, and I would kind of try to quiz them up about why certain things were being done, or why all of a sudden one trail was closed off and said, do not cross this line, this area is off limits, it's closed due to flood reclamation, or else they would say things like reclamation of some wild grass or flower that I knew was kind of a bunch of BS, because I know what's there and what isn't. And sometimes they would say, well, we got to do what head office tells us to do, whether we like it or not. And, they would never come out and say that there was things that they didn't know, but they indicated to me many times that there are events and sightings that they've even had that they could not explain what exactly they were. They could not identify the creature either by sight or by track. They would never tell me what it was. They'd never tell me what they thought it was. So they'd kind of just leave it at that.
When you have a job like that, it goes without saying, you've got to be really careful of what you share with the public. I'm not surprised at all that those guys were so guarded about what they would share with you.
Exactly.
Yeah, that only makes sense. The Stoney tribe has a lot of legends and stories about places near you. What are some of those stories and legends they've shared with you?
Well, the Stoney Nakota tribe are the native peoples of this area on the eastern slopes. They have fairly large reservations close to the ghost area. I've conversed with them and know several of them. We've even had teepee raising ceremonies with them recently, and they have offered to erect a traditional Indian teepee, which are quite large tents, as people know, but very few people know how they traditionally build them and why they built them that way. And a friend of mine has property. He has a ranch about 20 miles east of the ghost area, and members of the Stoney Nakota tribe that we know came to his ranch and erected a teepee for him, and we had a little bit of a ceremony blessing it and raising it, and then I had an opportunity to talk to some of the natives that I know, and one fellow in particular, he's one of the older fellas. I think he's about 72 years old. He's hard to understand. He has no teeth, but I try to quiz him up and get him away from the other people every once in a while and get him to tell me some stories about the area when he was a kid and what his elders passed down to him about the area. And they used to be quite a rowdy crew back in the day with his great-grandfather. They used to have a lot of battles and fight with the Indians coming from the western slopes, the Kootenai Indians coming into Alberta to do buffalo raiding parties, because there's no buffalo on the western slopes. They're only in the prairies, so they had to come into the Stoney Nakota Nation to do their hunting, and sometimes they had a bad habit of stealing a woman or two, apparently. And that didn't go over very good with the Stoney Nakota, so they would push them back and fight them and push them back through Devil's Gap into what's now British Columbia. And they had quite a few fallen braves that went down. And one of the reasons the Ghost River was called the Ghost River by the natives was many of their warriors had fallen in the Ghost River fighting the Kootenai Indians. And there was a legend that there was a ghost warrior that rode his horse backwards, and he would literally pick up the skulls of the fallen warriors and bring them back to have a proper ceremonial burying by the tribe and the elders. And that's one of the reasons why the ghost is kind of a sacred, spiritual, unnerving place for them, because a lot of their people died in that area.
From what you've told us about the place tonight, it sure does seem like an awfully creepy place, and I can understand why the Native Americans who used to live there gave that place such a wide berth. Well, Bobbie, it's about time to get out of here. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Well, Vic, I'll tell you, I've covered a lot of ground in my day. I've gone over hill and over dale and up and down more vertical than I can manage anymore. I don't do the vertical I used to when I was younger. I still enjoy going out into the mountains. To me, that's my church. That's really what it's all about. That's Mother Earth in its raw form, the way it's supposed to be. I don't think we're meant to be inside of these four walls all the time looking at computer screens like we are tonight, but that's the world today. So I still like to remove myself from it and get back to the wild and woolly wilderness. And I always knew that there's more out there than we know or we understand. And man has always tried to conquer his environment and shape it his way, but I think there's some things out there that aren't shapeable and they're not bendable. And they still live the way they wanted to live and always have. And when you get a big piece of 40,000 acres, and then you add another 80,000 acres to the DJ wildlands that connect to it, and then the size of Banff National Park connected to that, you've got a wilderness area that you cannot even imagine. And if I was a wild animal and I wanted to stay away from man, that's where I would go. Because in the Ghost, very, very few people go in there. So if I was a creature, whether I was a grizzly bear, a wolverine, an elk, a squirrel, and I wanted to get away from man, that's where I'd go. Because there's no development, very few people, no roads, no paths, and very remote.
From what you've told us tonight about the Ghost and what's around it, I'd say you're right. If you want to keep away from people, that would be the perfect place to go. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight, Bobbie. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Vic.
Thanks so much for being here. Well, have yourself a great night.
Thank you, Vic. Bye-bye.
Bye.